voice of FinTech.
Welcome to Voice of FinTech Asia Pacific series. As in Voice of FinTech podcast so far, here you will hear inspirational stories of entrepreneurs, corporate innovators, investors, ecosystem hub leaders from or close to the world of FinTech. Asia Pacific series will be hosted by amazing hosts based in the region, speaking to the leaders from Asia Pacific. Here is another one hosted by Chia.
Hi everyone. Today we have an amazing guest with us today, Rahul Singhal, who is the ex-head of Stripe Asia Pacific, previously at PayPal for close to 10 years in a number of positions, including ex-head of Southeast Asia, among other long-standing corporate exec roles in the fintech space. Today, Rahul will be sharing a little bit more about his experience in the fintech space in Southeast Asia and also building his company, Tazapay. Thank you very much for being here today with us, Rahul.
Hi, Jeng Yang. Thank you so much for having me on this show. I've heard a few of your podcasts, so feel very privileged to be a part of this podcast.
We are proud to have you on this podcast, also as a portfolio company of Saison Capital, which I am a principal for, and very eager to dive into your background, your experiences, and the company that you've built. So you have had significant experience in the Southeast Asian fintech and payment space. Can you introduce yourself and the team behind Tazapay? Can you help us understand a little bit about the story behind how and why you started to build Tazapay?
Yeah, thanks, Jeng Yang, for that question. And thanks for the introduction. As you said, I've been in payments and fintech for almost 20 years, even before it was called fintech, to be honest. Started my career in 99 with a bank and was working for a payment startup initially, then worked for an incumbent debit network of Singapore called Nets. Then I had an amazing experience of being at PayPal for over 10 years, joined them in 2009 and was there till 2019. And within these 10 years, I had multiple roles. I lived in Japan for a couple of years as well. And then most of it in Singapore. I was head of Southeast Asia. And during this period, just saw this phenomenal growth in payments, in commerce, in online, and in digitization generally. Some context, when I joined PayPal, we were a $20 billion company. And of course, we were part of eBay at that time. The joint valuation was around 20-30 billion. And by the time I left, PayPal alone was close to 200 billion. So saw this phenomenal growth. And then joined Stripe, was leading the APAC business, and pretty much was seeing the same story again. And at this point, I felt maybe it's time for me to try and do this myself. Was fortunate to come across two fantastic co-founders, Saroj and Arul. Saroj comes from a trade finance background, was working in the banking industry for several years. And Arul is our CTO. He used to be the CTO of Grab earlier and then spent 15 years in companies like Amazon and Microsoft. So I felt we had a good team. We had a great idea. And so jumped into it early part of this year. Very fortunate to have backers like Saison and Sequoia behind us. And so that's a little bit of a story of what my journey has been. I saw this problem quite closely when I was at PayPal, that a lot of focus on payments and fintechs has been on B2C. And a lot of problems there, which typically consumers and merchants face, have over the years a large part of them have been solved. And one of the big problems initially in B2C commerce used to be lack of trust. There used to be this famous internet meme that you don't know if the other person is a dog or not. And I think a lot of focus went into it in creating protections, establishing trust mechanisms for B2C commerce. But none of them actually have migrated to B2B. And lack of trust remains a big issue for B2B commerce. Transaction sizes of $30,000, $40,000. There isn't a safe mechanism to do transactions if the buyer and seller don't know each other. And we were seeing this very closely at PayPal. But PayPal, in a way, is very geared towards B2C. And so I had seen this gap, and I saw this again at Stripe and had first-hand experience of working with thousands of merchants where I could see this was a problem. So this is the fundamental problem we are trying to solve, that cross-border trade there is a huge trust deficit. Buyers and sellers, they meet for the first time, either online or on a trade show, and it's very difficult to get that trade done because one party, the seller always wants an advance payment, the buyer wants the shipment first. For very large transactions above 100,000, usually letters of credit have solved this problem. They're still very clunky and cumbersome, but for this huge this gap in the market of transaction sizes between $1,000 where B2C ends and about 100,000, that there's really no way for doing secure B2B commerce. So that's the problem we are trying to solve with a trusted e-commerce, trusted B2B payment solution. And I'll talk a little bit about it, more about it, but we see this as a huge opportunity. This is fundamentally giving an infrastructure solution to small merchants across Asia Pacific that they can do their cross-border transactions safely and securely.
Rahul, that's it's very interesting to meet you today and find out a little bit more about Tazapay. Could you give us an introduction about what Tazapay is and what you're trying to solve?
That's right. So Tazapay fundamentally tries to solve for trust in cross-border transactions. And I'll give you a very simple example. If you are a buyer in Germany and a seller is in Singapore, there is this huge trust deficit about whether the seller is going to ship me the item, the buyer is thinking, and the seller is thinking whether I'll get paid after I do the shipment. And this problem is by and large, as I said, problem solved in B2C commerce because there are chargeback mechanisms, protection mechanisms built in. And also solved to a large extent for big transactions, 100,000, 200,000 with letters of credit. But there is nothing really for transaction sizes of $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. The letters of credit are too costly, too cumbersome. And that's the problem we are trying to solve, that we give a platform to buyers and sellers where there's a trust deficit. Either it could be a new commercial pair or they don't necessarily trust each other to either give a credit. And hence, in that case, we are creating a system like a digital escrow system in Singapore, where buyers and sellers can agree on the terms of the trade on our platform, park the money with us, and then based on the initial escrow agreement, we release the money to the seller. Very simplistically, that's the description, but of course, it gets very, very complex at the back end. B2B cross-border trade is extremely complicated. There are things like multi-jurisdiction regulations. Buyers and sellers are in different countries. The terms of trade are incredibly complex. And I think what we're trying to do is make it extremely simple, bring it to the new age, make it completely digital so that these transactions can actually happen. A lot of these transactions fall through because buyers and sellers cannot agree on terms where both of them feel protected. So that's kind of the fundamental problem we are trying to solve. And solving this problem is not a single-threaded solution. You need to have a multifaceted approach. So one, of course, is a digital escrow solution, which is really our lighthouse solution. But it's also augmented with things like the ability to do business verification on the party with whom you're doing a trade, simplifying a lot of the trade terms. So these specific international terms can be simplified and codified in digital agreements so that it reduces the risk of a dispute at a later stage. So we're trying to combine all of this and create a platform for trusted commerce for B2B transactions.
Got it. That's really interesting. Would love to maybe dive a little bit into the range of products and how you see Tazapay developing if you'd be generous enough to share, and what are some of the major pain points that you see Tazapay tackling and the vision really for the company ahead?
You know, when we started this thing, we felt that we were solving $1 billion problem. We always knew this was a humongous opportunity. B2B commerce in most of our target markets is 7-8 times the size of B2C commerce. You know, take an example of Vietnam. B2B exports is probably 10x the size of B2C, and most of the venture money and investments are going in that area. So we had seen this gap. But as we've unraveled the problem and spoken to literally dozens and dozens of merchants, we are struck with this profound realization that this is actually $1 trillion problem. So that's the first thing. This is a big problem, and I think we're very fortunate to have converged on this problem. I always have felt that we should be working on a problem which is top of mind for customers. That when they sleep, they think about that problem, and they get up, they think about this problem. And lack of trust ability to do business with people you don't fully trust because you don't know them is one of the biggest problems our buyers and sellers. So that's some context on the problem statement. We, as I said, we're focusing on three products initially, and all of them fall under the umbrella of providing trust in cross-border transactions, B2B cross-border transactions. Expect a typical transaction size of $30,000 to $40,000. And the first real thing we have solved for is if a buyer and seller have met each other for the first time, either online or on a classified site, they can do a fairly detailed verification on the other party by coming to our platform. Right now, we are offering it free. Actually, it's already live on www.tazapay.com. And you can do a search on them. We pull out all sorts of information about their current status, their are they registered company, who are the shareholders, who are the directors, financial information, etc. So that becomes gives you the first level of trust. Over time, we want to make it user generated, that buyers and sellers can enter their own profile and we verify it, so it becomes like a LinkedIn profile for you for trade, which you can use to establish further trust. The second is when this first level of trust is established, then we offer a digital escrow service. We are based in Singapore. We're very fortunate because Singapore is considered as a very neutral country for trade. And so we'll operate our escrow service from Singapore and under a fairly robust regulatory regime using partners. And so we will bring the money into Singapore when the first thing is we do an escrow agreement on our platform, which helps codify the terms of the trade, clearly describes whose obligation is what, and at what point the buyer wants to release the money to the seller. And this could be either when the seller has manufactured the item, or when the seller has shipped the item, or when the deliveries happen. So we clearly outline those agreements. We then get the money in the most cost-effective way into Singapore using a array of virtual bank accounts, so that we don't have to incur costly wire transfer and foreign exchange costs. That is, of course, kind of inbuilt in our solution, simplifying these complex money transfers. And then once the sale goes ahead and the seller has fulfilled his or her obligation, at that point the seller can upload documents showing proof that they have fulfilled their obligation as per the original agreement, and then we will release the money. So that at a simple level, that's what we're doing. There's a lot of under the hood complexity. International trade has things like Incoterms, which describe what the buyer is supposed to do, the seller has to do, have to absorb the complexities of import-export regulation. And one thing which we realized was that in B2B is so complex, and we've got to embrace this complexity. So that's what we've done. And so that's the second thing. And the third thing was what we're going to do is codify these agreements and make them formal. A lot of these agreements for buyers and sellers tend to remain on WhatsApp and simple emails, which doesn't give them much coverage for dispute. So that's the third thing we do. So there's a package. We feel this is going to serve a big need in the market. So that's what we hope to launch in the next couple of months. The first service, as I said, is already live. But I'd say one thing. The problem is so acute and the solution is fairly obvious. So the question sometimes people ask is this seems like such a big problem with such an obvious solution. Why hasn't this been done already? And it's an important question. And to me, the answer is because it's incredibly complex. You need to have a congregation of certain skills to solve this problem. Understanding multi-jurisdictional regulations, understanding complexity of B2B trade, understanding complexity of foreign exchange and money movement, understanding how do you do at scale merchant acquisition with low CAC, high LTV, understanding how do you create simplicity and create comprehension with amazing design. So it's not easy to pull all this together, and I'm very proud that we pulled together a team which have all the skills to really tackle this problem head on. And thanks again for your support, Jeng Yang, in getting us to this stage.
Got you. The pleasure's all mine. And with that team that you've got together, very impressive team, by the way. The problem that you're really tackling, that digitization, building that trust along that trade process across Southeast Asia, and also helping to manage payments. That's really an interesting space that I think is that you're really tackling. So since you brought up kind of a little bit of your experiences looking at it from a B2B to B2C perspective, maybe let's take a step back and I'd love to get your thoughts on the Southeast Asia fintech and payment space in terms of where you see it now, where you see it going, and how it compares to developed or our Western markets. I know you alluded to a little bit of this when you talked about B2B versus B2C, but would love to get your thoughts on that.
I think any fintech practitioner in Southeast Asia will tell you the biggest problem in Southeast Asia compared to either the Western markets or even larger markets like China and India is that it's a very fragmented market. There is, with the exception of Indonesia, there is no scale in one single market. And it's very difficult to launch a regional solution unless it's like a cross-border solution or a remittance solution which can be localized to every market. Every market has a different language, different fintech stack in terms of how banks are organized. It's very different from a regulatory standpoint. Every country has a different regulatory regime. There's no passporting, and this has been one of the biggest challenges for getting any level of scale as far as fintech and payments is concerned in Southeast Asia. And that's why you don't, in spite of being as a block, we are about 650 million people, and in terms of combined GDP, it's pretty large. It's probably the sixth or seventh largest in the world. This, in spite of this, you don't see any equivalent of Alipay or PayPal in this market. So this is one big challenge. In spite of that, I think a lot of strides have been made in fintech payments in general. I think one of the most significant achievements has been the mass digitization of cash. Even 5-6 years ago, vast majority of people were not connected to the digital mainstream. There was no card, banking penetration was 20-25%, and these people were very much left out. There were many wallets which were trying to serve the unbanked, but very disjointed, no scale, no acceptance. But I think last 3-4 years, players like Gojek, Grab, and a whole host of prepaid card providers have tried to solve that problem. So one thing is we've seen hundreds of millions of people come into the digital mainstream with digital wallets or prepaid cards, and they can participate in this wonderful world of fintech and payments. So that's kind of one very encouraging thing we've seen. We haven't seen really at any at-scale player like you see in China and Southeast Asia. Even lending, it remains very, very fragmented. We have players, but none of them are operating at the scale at which operators in China or India are operating. So scale is always going to be a problem. But I think there are a lot of green shoots here that we have seen. What probably is needed is a more homogeneous regulation across these markets. Sometimes it's worrying that a lot of these countries are now requiring data localization, etc., which just increases the entry barrier and makes it very, very difficult for global and regional players to have a footprint. So there, while we take 2 steps forward, once in a while we take 1 step back as well. So I think in spite of a lot of the progress, the fragmentation in the market remains to be, in my opinion, the single biggest challenge that we have. Second, beyond this fragmentation, there's also a lot of fragmentation in, at least in B2C payments, on the number of payment methods that are available. In most Western markets, credit cards, Visa, Master, debit cards will take care of 70-80% of your users. Here, its cards really become very meaningless in a lot of these markets. So that's a big challenge. There are multiple payment methods, wallets, bank transfers, which again aggregation has been quite a challenge there. So it is quite ripe for disruption. Some companies are doing a great job, but I think the biggest challenge remains, as I said, in finding scale across these markets. We are fortunate; we chose cross-border as an area, which by definition is borderless. We operate out of Singapore and service exporters, importers, and traders across these markets. So in a way bypass that specific issue of fragmentation. But for local players who are providing either an issuing service or a lending service or an acquiring service, this remains a big problem.
Got it. Thanks a lot. That's very insightful. It's 2020. COVID has severely affected SMEs in the region, which is one of your core targets, and has brought a lot of uncertainty into the markets, even till today. Has this affected Tazapay's roadmap in any way? Understanding that you're obviously an early stage company.
It hasn't. Of course, when we started the pandemic, it already started. In fact, we felt we've started it at the right time because the need for digitization would be even higher for a lot of our segment. And as I said, we solve a trust problem. At least 2 years ago, if you needed to, you had no other way, you would take a flight and go to your counterparty's country. If you were doing business in Singapore with a German buyer, there was still an option of getting on a flight, going and visiting the office of your buyer or seller and trying and get that rapport going and establish trust. I think that option is pretty much out, I think, for the next at least year or so, if not longer. Uh, so if you're not traveling and you're not meeting people, I think the lack of trust, the deficit increases quite a bit. So I think we are very, very well placed to solve that problem with the set of solutions that we have. And the second thing is just a lot of these manual processes that SMBs have, they realize they will have to move away from it. And that's a core thing we are doing around digitizing their trade flows, digitizing their documentation, and basically digitizing the way they create trust with each other rather than a manual way and a digital way. So we feel we are very well poised. If we obviously don't have a legacy, and I think that's a big advantage. Most iconic companies were actually set up immediately after the great financial crisis. And I think that's true for us. We started in the pandemic, and we are really made to order for this pandemic. The need has just become even greater. So we feel that not only is it an opportunity, it's an obligation for us to try and solve that problem as quickly as we can.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Just want to set the scene for the listeners also. All you've mentioned where you can find Tazapay on the Tazapay website, but perhaps you want to share a little bit in terms of when you're officially launching on the roadmap.
We obviously there are always dependencies in this question from multiple angles, but we've already launched our first product. So I'd be delighted if whoever is listening can log on to www.tazapay.com and have a look. We've got an amazing knowledge center which answers a lot of questions which typical SMBs have. What are the Incoterms? What are the import-export regulation? And we've deliberately done that because we want our go-to-market to be very content-heavy and focus on content marketing rather than performance marketing. My experience with performance marketing has been that you spend $10 on performance marketing, and that's money you'll never see back. It's gone. Whereas money you spent on content is sustainable, it stays with you, it can keep generating returns over a long period of time. So that's kind of one strategy we have, and hopefully when you see our website, you'll see some parts of that strategy. So that's the first thing. The first product we've launched is business verification, which we can verify your counterparty. It's live, it's free, and we'll be constantly expanding our data sources. We launch our digital escrow service early next year, potentially Jan-Feb, earlier the better. We will do a limited beta as early as December, and then try to push for public availability as soon as possible. We have a fair amount of pent-up demand. Over time, once we've proven this model, proven the unit economics, we also want to go and target large marketplaces and freight forwarders and shipping companies as channel partners, places where SMBs congregate. So that's the second part of it. We want to be system of record for the SMB ultimately, and whether that means capturing trade history, simplifying some of their workflows, anything which helps them digitize and create ultimate trust is on our roadmap. But in the immediate future, we are working very hard to launch our digital escrow service in the next 2 to 3 months.
Got it. So if anyone also is in the SMB space or large marketplace with a lot of cross-border transactions, they should definitely reach out to Tazapay team.
Absolutely.
Great. So perhaps ending on a more personal note, you've had a very long and successful career as a senior executive for some very large and very successful fintech companies, and you're now building your own endeavor. I'm curious to get your take on what's been the most surprising part of your experience so far, and any words of advice for those with a similar background thinking of going through a similar entrepreneurship path?
Thanks. That's a great question. It wasn't an easy decision. I had been thinking and toying with this for a long while, and I saw the tremendous growth at PayPal and Stripe, and always had this yearning that I can potentially do it myself, and try to see if we can build something which of value. One of the challenges of working with large MNCs, especially when you're not in their global headquarters, is that the roles are very go-to-market focused, and you don't get the satisfaction of actually building something and seeing something. So I've always had that yearning, and that's what took me here. It's for founders who are uh, slightly on the I would hate to use the word older, but maybe if you had 15, 20 years experience, it's a very different decisions criteria. You've got finances to take care of, you have kids, mortgage, etc. So I think the first thing people need to make sure is that they can take care of all that, and that's they've got some buffer of few years of runway, etc. So I think that was the first thing which I had mentally prepared for and planned for a while to get to this stage. Emotionally, it's not easy initially when you always have this sort of yearning to have a stable job. And I've spoken to multiple founders. It gets easier over time, especially when you start seeing traction and success in your own venture. And what I have done is I've created a document for myself, one pager, which describes why did I do this in the first place, what drove me to this decision, what choices I'm making, and every now and then I look at it. So just to remind myself that why am I in it? And to your question about what surprised me was when I was doing this. I've led fairly large teams in my tenure, and I've always felt maybe it'll be challenging to go and doing things which I had done many, many years ago and really getting your hands dirtied. I was prepared for it, but I felt that would be a challenge. But actually, that has not been a challenge at all. So that surprised me. I've really enjoyed it. Even things like writing the license application, or getting deep into the product specification, or actually running a campaign myself on Google and Facebook. All those things I think have been fairly satisfying and enjoyable. What I really miss, and maybe this some people who are thinking about this would resonate, is doing things at scale. I think what something which was surprised me was things I did not feel I would miss, but I miss is operating at scale, looking at your daily metrics, making decisions based on data, doing things, and pretty much in the next 2 weeks, seeing an impact of a couple of $1 million. And you can get that in big companies when you're operating a large business at scale. So that the joy of being an operator on a day-to-day basis, at least in the early stage, you will not get it. So that I do definitely miss. But I'm pretty sure we'll get to that scale at some stage. But it's been supremely satisfying. It's just supremely satisfying to actually see that something which you want to get done in front of it, even if it's a simple thing like a user flow or a UX. In big companies, it just takes forever to do the lobbying and get something out. So that satisfaction of translating your thoughts and your ideas into a working product, I think that is supremely satisfying, and not having to worry about unnecessary posturing, unnecessary reporting, etc. So that's kind of been the positive side. On the whole, I think it's been a very, very satisfying experience. And whoever is considering this, I'd say just definitely give it a shot. It would. I have learned more in the last 6 months than I did in the last 5 years about myself, about team interactions, about building culture, about how to take things to the market, and I think it's supremely satisfying so far.
Got you. Thanks, Rahul. That was refreshingly honest, and really appreciate some of your frank and honest thoughts on the topic of leaving a large company and building your own endeavor. Thanks a lot, Rahul. It was really great to have you and to hear you share about the Southeast Asian fintech and payment space and the exciting things that you're doing at Tazapay. It was great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jin Yang. Thanks a ton.
Thank you for listening to Voice of Fintech podcast. If you haven't already, check out also voiceoffintech.com, where you will find all the episodes and additional resources related to the podcast. You can also subscribe to Voice of Fintech on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or any other podcast app that you like. If you have any suggestions on the topics or guests or how to make this podcast better for you, please email us at info@voiceoffintech.com. Happy to hear from you. Thank you.